All right. Uh, Professor Susan Krumdieck trained in mechanical engineering, and I would characterize as the foremost global proponent of transition engineering. So that's who we're talking to today. Cool. So the way I thought about doing this conversation is like if we're playing volleyball or badminton or something like that, and I just have some ideas and I just lob it over the net to you, and you swat it down or swat it back or hit it out of bounds or whatever. You just like you keep the ball back in play or whatever. So I'm just gonna lob random across the net to you and see what
Let's ramble.
And I think that like in the process of doing that, right? So we're going to talk about transition engineering and what that means and specific projects that you've been working on and case studies. And I think all of that will come out in due course in this sort of rambling back and forth. Okay.
Sure.
The first thing I wanted to, I was like, it probably doesn't matter where we start, but you wrote a book review recently that was published in Nature about a book that was on this concept of wicked problems. And my sense from your work is that a mental framework of thinking about things as wicked problems is central to transition engineering approach. And so a good place to start is talk about what do we mean by wicked problems and kind of elaborate that. But I also want to start with a criticism from my own perspective and see what you do with this, right?
All right.
Yeah, here we go. One of the ways that I talk about the calamities that we face, and as a criticism, I'm an environmental engineer by training. A criticism of my discipline, when I have very high expectations that environmental engineers and scientists would grasp these big sustainability concepts and be on the forefront of dealing with it, and my disappointment in the reality of my discipline, where I gave a talk several years ago, a short talk at the National Academies of Science and Engineering that I called "Praying to False Gods," basically to elaborate this a dysfunctional approach that I identify that characterizes my discipline. And part of that is what I call solutions thinking, right? When we love to think of solutions for stuff, right? Because we think in terms of problems and solutions, and if the clutch wears out of my truck and my truck's not driving properly, that's a problem. Well, I can buy a new clutch and install it and my truck drives properly then, so problem solution, right? And that's not the sort of meta challenges that we're facing are not problems with solutions. They're calamities or dilemmas or things that for which there really isn't any kind of a solution, but there are various types of responses that could be advantageous or disadvantageous or whatever. But maybe the first step to get our minds right is to stop thinking in terms of problems and solutions and start thinking in terms of calamities and dilemmas with trade-offs and responses and that sort of thing. So my first criticism of wicked problems is it embeds the problem in the name of the thing, because this is really hard. I try not to use the word problem. That's really hard to do because I'm like, that's going to lock me into problem solution thinking. I don't want to be there.
Yeah.
Problem that but I use problem. And now wicked problem is a problem. But maybe it's actually really smart because my understanding is a component of wicked problems is that they're caused by the same people or thinking that are trying to solve it. So by calling a wicked problem a problem and embedding the word problem in the name of the thing, it's embodying the thing it's meant to represent. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, possibly. But it's actually a little bit more interesting than that. Okay. I totally agree with you. And Josh, I feel that you are a transition engineer and you should stand up and lead. All right. So in transition engineering, we actually ban the word solution. How about that?
Oh, that's great.
Right. So the wicked problem question. All right. By definition, a wicked problem is it's in a system with lots of complexity. So it's hard to see what's actually going on. It is not linear. There isn't a cause effect. There isn't a problem solution. There's not these two thing matchups. It's not linear. Linear requires you have 2 points lie in between, right? So it's not like that. It's more like spaghetti. It's a mess. It's messy. It's hard to even define. And for sure, it is going to defy solutions. So that's the definition of wicked problem. Is that helpful to have a definition? Okay, at least we know we have one of those because it's doing all that. But why something is wicked, why is it a wicked problem, is because you're asking the wrong question. Mm.
Yeah.
So what? So the wrongest question in the universe is, how do we decarbonize? Because that implies that we're going to keep doing the same behaviors and activities and economy that we built out of oil, but somehow do it green, and that'd be nice. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Not a thing. Wicked. All right. So you're actually asking the wrong question. That's what a wicked problem is.
You know, I had probably a dumb idea, which is that I was gonna on purpose try to say things to you that are that you would consider to be controversial or shocking or like catch you on your back foot, and I think I'm gonna totally fail at that. But that's
well, that was with the first ball. I sent it right back to you.
Send it right back. Okay, so we'll keep going on that. But okay, so I'm gonna try again. And you said,
Okay.
you know, the wrongest question or a really wrong question. Oh, you also said that you banned the word solutions. Well, when I was teaching at the university, I told my students I would take off points if they used the word sustainability.
Ooh.
If they could talk about unsustainability as much as they want, but they talk about sustainability, given this idea that like, oh, it's just around the corner if we just, you know, change our light bulbs, and we're like, so anyway, I had the same kind of, I guess it's censorship.
But we don't want sustainability, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. It's okay. So here's my next attempt
to.
to.
Wasn't the challenge. All right.
Okay. So a dumb question or a bad question is, how do we decarbonize? So I would go. I think we should shut up about climate change. I'm tired of hearing about climate change. Not interested in hearing about climate change. I'm not motivated to do anything because of climate change. If somebody comes and says you should do this really hard project or whatever, you should make this big sacrifice for climate change, I'm like, get out of here with that noise. I think we should shut up about it, move on with our lives, right? What do you think about that?
What? Are you an oily?
I'm being paid by ExxonMobil.
That's right. Clearly. All right. Actually, I want to deal with the sustainability word first, because that is actually the birth of transition engineering. I was a sustainability engineer, and I'll bet you were too. A lot of us were. We're working on sustainability, hand on heart, for sure. Of course, because that's good. Sustainable energy, sustainable water, sustainable agriculture, sustainable materials. Yeah, of course we were. And then I was the New Zealand government. I had moved to New Zealand to try and figure out what sustainable was. So the New Zealand government sent me to a AAAS meeting. So that's American Association for the Advancement of Science in San Francisco. And because the New Zealand government sent me, the people at the meeting thought I was an important person. So I got invited into a roundtable discussion, which had the heads of every one of the American first tier universities. It had the head of the National Science Foundation and the subheads of the different groups. And they were all in the room for 2 days to work out, what does the framework look like for funding sustainability research? Because we want the sustainability, clearly. So who do we fund to do what? Fun fight, anyone? So I sat very quietly in my corner of the room because I don't want anybody to find out I'm just an assistant professor and I really shouldn't be in the room. So I'm sitting very quietly. And by the end of day 2, we had used so many sticky notes and sticky dots and pieces of paper, yada, yada, yada. And what we had come to was we had an agreement that what we had to do was define sustainability first. And so my head exploded quietly in my corner. And I thought, absolutely not. That can't be right. It's 2007. That can't be what we have to do. Because I've been hearing that for the last, who knows how long. That can't be right. We got the smartest people in the room. Why are you saying that? And I got, luckily, a light bulb moment, which was, you would never say that about safety, that you can't do anything about safety until you can define safety. How about security? Same thing? Yeah. Okay, so wait a minute. When it comes to unacceptable loss, unacceptable performance of a perfectly good performing system that's making money for everybody and it's all great, that that what we do is we look at what the unacceptable part is, what's no, that's not going to be allowed anymore. And when we do, we'll see that we've accepted it for a really long time before it finally got to some threshold of unacceptability to somebody who decided, you know what, maybe we should do it different. Maybe we shouldn't have that happen anymore. And that has become a study of mine ever since, of looking at engineering history. And I say engineering because systems, factories, ships don't change unless engineers are involved. And safety comes from engineering, but it's a whole system thing. It's engineering pushing back up, and engineering taking a disciplined stance that says, no, we do it this way, right? This way, buddy. And it's a whole culture. And so I started saying, okay, it can't be that we're working on sustainability. It must be that we're working to disallow unsustainable things that clearly are creating unacceptable loss. And that's what transition engineering is. It's about changing existing systems. And it is a culture. You create a culture by doing it. You understand new regulations. You create new economic understandings by doing it. So yeah, that's my beef with sustainability. We don't say sustainable either. We say what's unsustainable, because you can for sure define what's unsustainable. You're right about that.
Yeah. Well, I hate to have
Want to discuss that anymore before we go on to the other one?
I've got some more. So I just want to say that, the unfortunate thing is you're hopelessly behind continuing to talk about sustainability, because we have moved on and now we talk about nature-based solutions.
Yes.
We went right through resilience. I thought we didn't spend enough time with resilience as a key buzzword. I like that one, but now we're on to nature-based solutions. Sustainability, that's so like 2007, So anyway, here's what I want to. Okay, this is the tie that I want to do with the history of transition engineering. Something that I learned from you that I had never thought about before was how engineering disciplines emerge. Okay. And what you were just describing in that meeting of the top scientists in the country was a bunch of pointy-headed intellectuals sitting around in a room thinking up what we should be doing, right? What's the theory and what are get all the theory and concepts nailed down. And then
actually, they were the bean counters. They were the bosses. So it was the heads of the universities and the head of the National Science Foundation. So it was politics is what we were doing.
Politics and money and all that kind of stuff. But the point was, we got a bunch of people sitting around in a room theorizing about things. Here's what I want to point out. So when I was in college and I was studying, I was in PChem, and we learned about Maxwell's equations and laws of thermodynamics and all that kind of stuff. And the quiz, and they're teaching us the theory of working out all this. Like, apparently James Clerk Maxwell had the highest IQ of anybody ever. Something anyway, it was hard to understand. Entropy, I'm fuzzy on the partial differential of entropy with respect to pressure at constant temperature. I still don't really have a good grasp of that. The point is, that was the working out of the concepts of thermodynamics, right? And the classic example that we hear about why it's so important that we have science, because it enables technology and development and innovation. The classic example of thermodynamics is the steam engine, right? Created by James Watt. You know something about that guy in Scotland. I assume that's the university you're at, named for that.
At Heriot-Watt University, yes. His statue's right out front.
Yeah, and that guy, with mother as a necessity of invention, invented the steam engine 100 years before anybody knew about theories about thermodynamics. So I was like, wait a minute. I think the technicians and the technical problem solvers are out there trying to solve problems because they see a need and they're trying to respond to something. And then later the theoreticians come along and wrap the nice theory and math around things and explain why that's true from us. And so I suspect that's how things actually develop. And when you talk about transition engineering being born, you highlighted things like how safety engineering came about, because in the early industrial revolution, like factories and trains and everything, they were all death traps, and it was just mass carnage, and they had to do something about that. And then environmental engineering, my discipline, happened because the river in Cleveland kept catching on fire from all the pollution, things like that. So it wasn't like a bunch of theoreticians sat around, or bean counters, or administrators, or the president of the university decided what we needed to be doing. That's the opposite of how things actually happen. And what actually happens is more of an organic up from the bottom approach of people saying, hey, we have a problem to solve here. And that's
somebody gets triggered. Somebody does.
yeah, that's how new stuff comes about.
Right.
So describe like where transition engineering, it's like, is this thing, it's just oozing out of our circumstances right now out of necessity?
I think I moved to New Zealand from Colorado, not to work on transition engineering because I didn't know what that was, but I knew I wanted to work on sustainability. But I'd been doing sustainable energy and sustainable buildings, and the thing you put the sustainable in front of. And I kept thinking, yeah, but how do we actually change things? Because you could work on sustainable technologies over in the lab or with an SBIR, or, you go play with that. Yes, isn't that lovely? You could be a James Watt. Because we believe in innovation. We believe that we're going to grow the economy. So let's have green innovation. Let's have green growth, right? So all that good stuff. But I really wanted to know, yeah, but how are we actually going to change what we're doing? And it was about 7 years into that when that safety light bulb went on, which was, okay, well, you got to work on the change, not the miracle green technology, but the actual change of the system you've already got. And while that, I don't know what that would be like, but it's just a thing to work on. So what if we worked on it? Because who's actually working on that? Where you see it worked on is where it has to change. Like you said, the river's on fire. 30 years before that, the river was dead, but it finally caught on fire. Macondo, right? Piper Alpha. There's the long list of these things, and you know what? The steam engine was actually the birth of mechanical engineering because of the safety issues. 1776, I think it was, or Watt sees this thing. He is just a technician. He's not an academic. Just a technician. He was the guy who kept the experiments working so that people could see how pistons worked and that sort of thing. And he realized that when it was colder, you got more energy, more power out of the thing. And so, well, let's make it colder then. And oh boy, there you go. An observed truth executed by somebody who knew how the machine worked. Key. Observed truth. Do you know how the machine works? Doesn't matter if you don't know how the machine works. So just preaching about sustainability or being concerned about climate change, not going to change anything. You have to actually know how the machine works. All right, so he invented the steam engine. He got patents on the steam engine where the condenser is at atmospheric pressure, and he got a patent on the steam engine where the condenser is lower than atmospheric pressure and the boiler is higher. So the patent on the high pressure boiler steam engine, he did not let anyone build it, and he didn't build it. He said, that's too damn, that's going to blow up. And he was right. His patent ran out, he was dead, and the Americans grabbed that one, went with it. And they started blowing things up like maniacs.
Yes.
Look how fast you can go in your steamship if you crank, if you close the valve and crank up the pressure.
Yeah.
Right. Boom. Right. And so that went on for 50 years. They were blowing people up.
Oh, wow.
And nobody liked it, right? The city of Philadelphia said, we're over this blowing up steamship thing. And so nobody liked it. And there were lots of miracle solutions. Now, this one I love. There was a miracle solution put in place because somebody said, well, it's the boiler. You're using steel for the boiler. You're using pig iron and steel, and that's why they're blowing up. You should use copper because there's no distillery that's ever blown up. Thermodynamics much? We're talking about a pressure vessel, right? Building up pressure in it. And yeah, copper's the solution, clearly. And so the companies that were building boilers were like, no, not a good idea, but it was the solution. And so sure enough, they started building, they were required, right, to build the copper boilers, and the blowing up got way worse. And then there was a really big industry in people doing horoscopes to tell if your stars were aligned and your ship was going to blow up. So helping people figure out which ship they wanted to get on. when actually probably it was more about the captain wanting to go fast than it was about the stars, probably a little bit. And so eventually what you got
So we would call those green jobs. That's green job creation.
yes.
we need people with an astrolabe and a horoscope to tell us if our ship's going to blow up.
Absolutely.
We don't want to put them out of work.
Yes. And so what finally happened was the ASME, and that happened about 5 years after something magical happened, which was that at the Pennsylvania Institute of Technology, it was at the time, it was one of the 4 schools that was teaching mechanics at the time. So you had some academics there, and you had people from the industry got together and said, we're going to sort this out, and we're going to do it by understanding the science behind it. Because nobody had, okay, you teach thermodynamics. Do you teach the boiling heat transfer? It's tricky stuff. We still teach what they figured out back in 1900, that as boiling happens, you get this huge pressure expansion, and you have to keep the flow going right, or you get boom. So they figured that out. They figured out tensile testing. So they built the first tensile testing machine to figure out what kind of materials could actually withhold that kind of pressure, because pressure, where else would you find that in the world, right? They figured out the pressure gauge and made that. And here's the fun part. This was funded by the very first research grant ever given by the US government. The science behind boilers. And once you had that science, then within 4 years, they wrote a report recommending what the regulations had to be. The regulations are that you have to train inspectors. They have to inspect. You have to put a cage around the valve so people can't fiddle with it and get a higher pressure. And you have to train your operators, and you have to make it illegal for the captains to race. And the ASME was formed a couple of years later and wrote the boiler code, and the number of explosions just disappeared. So science, people who know what they're doing, academic integrity, doing it right, writing the regulations that are required, pushing them back up the slope. Those were then enacted kind of loosely at first, but then the mechanical engineers formed their own boiler code and enacted them themselves. And that's what did it. So there you go. That's your how an engineering discipline. And I call these a corrective discipline, that there was something going wrong, and that's what's actually motivating the work.
Yeah.
And you figure out how to correct what's wrong. Some disciplines are about growing more stuff, getting more, making it faster, whatever, and that's fine. But some are corrective, and so that's what we want to understand from history. Do you like that story?
That's a great story. That's a bunch of stuff I didn't know. That was a great story. I'm going to listen to that back and really remember.
And yes, they built the steam tables. That was another one of the things they had to do. They had to actually build the steam tables so that you could figure out what was going on.
Cool. I'm trying to think where I want to go from there.
Well, we should be getting a little bit inspired now, that if we actually take on the hard problems, we can solve them. This was unsolvable for 90 years, and lots of chicanery and snake oil and nonsense was happening. And so we are going to have to fast circuit. We can't wait 90 years. These things, happen naturally. Or I got one more piece of the boiler story for you. Boilers started blowing up in France too. And the French government said, okay, that's not okay. Grenoble University, Top Guns, let's get our Top Guns in heat transfer, which they had a few, they had Carnot, and let's get the Top Guns in the room, figure it out. And they did, and they had the regulations written, and they had their steam tables done in 4 years done. So they only ever killed like 25 people, and in America, they killed thousands.
Right. Yeah. They leapfrogged a little bit.
If you put those magic ingredients together, it can happen very fast.
I mean, I think something else about your story that I think resonates strongly in our current situation, or at least my view on it, was that there was already negative consequences piling up that kind of forced it. And I feel like it's from our culture, being visionary or optimistic or something. Like we sort of imagine that we can go in a direction, just by plotting it out or something. But in reality, we tend to be reactive, and we tend to be like there's accumulated suffering that happens because of things, and then we sort of get around to figuring out what to do about it, which I think is just that to me it seems like how it is. And so I like, one of the things that we talk about a bit on this podcast is so like, for example, a couple of years ago we interviewed Richard Heinberg. I'm sure you know his work.
I do.
Yeah, such a cool
I
guy.
even with him a little bit, and he reviewed my book for me.
Yeah. So great guy. I've read a ton of his stuff. It's been super informative to me. And he's such a sweet person. I didn't want to be a jerk to him the way that I'm a jerk to you in this interview. But we're kind of and this was like, I think it was kind of near the end of COVID. And I mean, you may have noticed that society in the United States is like a little bit tumultuous these days.
A
little bit, and we're not getting along as well as we would like to, maybe. But so we're like, okay, well, we're like, the optimism part is like, how are we actually going to deal with this stuff? What do we do? And he kind of talks about how, like, well, we probably need to have quotas and rationing, and it kind of goes into this thing. And I kind of feel like there's a school of thought in this sort of recognizing the unsustainability crisis, but then the framework for thinking about how to deal with it kind of posits this idea that, like, well, if we could have sort of a super friends council of eco-technical experts that would, identify how much nature we can use and instruct us how to maneuver into, Kate Raworth's donut economics. We'll have this we'll have Jason Hickel and a bunch of really smart people tell us how we just maneuver society into the sustainability donut, right? And Richard is kind of going on about all this stuff, and I'm kind of thinking, like, yeah, that's appealing. I would love that. But we live in a low trust society. And if you're going to put up a new group of experts, they're going to tell everybody what they need to be doing, like, this is not going to fly. Like, a lot of our experts have thoroughly discredited themselves through corruption and getting stuff wrong and being untruthful and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of my friends at universities, they wring their hands and they say, oh, isn't it terrible that the public doesn't trust the experts anymore and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like on the side of all the hillbilly hobbits out here in Appalachia. Like, yeah, I get not trusting the experts. Okay. Like, I don't come from a family that trusted experts, like, there's a legitimacy to be skeptical of power because we see evidence of dishonesty. We see evidence of corruption. We see evidence of getting it wrong, of censoring dissent, and all, and we've been living through that, And so the kind of question that I wanted to put to Richard, I want to put to you is, if you could have it your way, it's like we would just get all the really environmentally enlightened people together and figure it out, and then everybody would sing Kumbaya and we would go along with it. It would be wonderful. But that's not going to happen. Like, things are very fractious, and we're moving from a unipolar world into a multipolar world where countries are focusing on their own interests, which we're not going to live in this harmony global village kind of thing. Like, that's not working out. That's not the reality that we're living in. So like, if you're a person who's kind of in the know about this, and you realize that this sort of, United Nations of ecological sustainability technocrat crew is not going to emerge and save us, that it's going to be down to localities, or how do you think about enabling a transition engineering vision in the face of, like, all the fractiousness and the conflict, and it's like there's no way we're going to get consent, like, we're going to have dissensus, not consensus. So how do you think about that? And and what's your approach?
Right. Well, that's a big piece. I guess I would say probably back in the 90s, I thought the soft path, the visioning, the kumbaya, that clearly that was what we needed, was more of that. And sure, why not? That would be nice. But one thing that in asking how do we change what needs to change, you have to be honest. So the first creed of transition engineering is prevent what's preventable. So If it's unsustainable, you got to change it. How? I don't know. Get busy. Get on to it. And the second one is you have to be honest. So honesty, where does that get you? Well, honesty means that you look at things the way they are. You look at the power structures the way they are. You look at the social reality the way it is. And the infrastructure, what really is there in front of your face, not what you wish was there, but what really is there. And then the third creed is that you have to work from a position of knowledge about what is. So it's one of the reasons that we work quite transdisciplinarily. The work that I do now, basically setting up how transition engineering delivers, what that delivery vehicle looks like, and how to train people who already know systems into how to do this work of changing systems. You have to know the technical system, but now you have to change the whole system. So what does it look like? Okay. The closest analogy I would say is that it looks like a good public health system. Oh, dang it. I'm talking to an American. Now picture it. If you have a nice HMO, a nice public health system where you're collectively bringing resources to bear on what? The problems of ill health, like what it is that's going wrong with people's health. And you pull together expertise where that's appropriate, and you pull together psychological and self-help where that's appropriate, and you pull together family help and carers where that's appropriate. And so what you're doing is you're working on the mission of restoring health to an individual. If it's a group health problem, then you work on restoring health to that group. And so what in the world can engineers do about that? Well, if you look at some of the projects that we have done, and we've done quite a few projects in New Zealand, the things that we end up designing and helping people to build are new social infrastructures that allow them to redevelop, repurpose, create resiliency in the existing infrastructures that they've got, working with their local engineers, managers, technicians, providers. All right. So you've got an existing water system, for example, that is yours, and you better take care of it. You better figure out how it works, and you better figure out how everybody who depends on that water system is going to learn how that system works and why, when we're having a drought, they need to reduce their water use. So creating kind of feedback loops, information understanding loops, co-participation in safe operation loops. And when you do that, you also start to build a little bit of social capital into the system that you don't have when it's just top down. Somebody just should do everything for me because I paid my taxes, damn it. Right. So sort of a from the ground up, reweaving and recreating systems that, they might not always work, but at least we know how they work, and if they break, how to fix them. Mm-hmm. So a real live working through life. And I think if we had 50% of our population were farmers, we'd have a lot more of that in our system, because that's the life of a farmer, having to just deal with whatever today and continuously thinking, knowing how things work, and just dealing with stuff. So moms are really good at this. That's why I think we probably need to have a lot more women involved in whatever this is that we're going to do. Yeah, grandmas are really good at it. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, you bring up a lot of interesting points. I'm trying to decide what I want to kind of tug on there for a second.
I loved you, the EDI.
I think about barriers. Okay, so good example of bringing up the U.S. health system, which is expensive and dysfunctional, frustrating and stuff. And, something that we have to deal with are the realities of politics and power and money. A lot of the reason that things are the way they are is because there's companies that make a ton of money off of it being this way, and they can hire lobbyists and so on and keep things the way they are. And so, the way I think about
Let's grab onto that one. Let's grab it.
yeah,
Because yes, there's companies that are making just ridiculous, obscene amounts of money. Doing what? Selling us what they've cut us out of being able to do ourselves.
yeah. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. Where this goes, like a word that came to mind while you were speaking was self-reliance. You're talking about promoting more local self-reliance, like people knowing how their water system works, people knowing the ins and outs of basic health and wellness, and serving each other with that kind of thing in a cooperative kind of way. That is 1,000,000% resonant with a lot what we circle around a lot on the Doomer Optimism podcast, is basically what we see as kind of an antidote or a way forward to the dysfunction of globalization, the vulnerability, the fragility, the unsustainability, is the redevelopment of local economies that from an
and it's business. It's not kumbaya. It's
No.
business, but it's a level playing field for business against global capitalism. So engineer that.
Yeah.
And it's information, it's understanding local sensibilities and creating the space. I think you can't rely on a culture of shared purpose and behavior, because that's been purposely destroyed and capitalized again.
Yeah.
So recreating that trust, building trust from the ground up, this is hard work. This is where we need our creative minds.
Right. So yes. Right. And so like I think it'll be really helpful and interesting now is to talk about different approaches to doing just that. So part of I taught at the university. I was an assistant professor for about 3 years. And then a lot of stuff happened in my life and a lot of things changed. And I left that job and now I'm back to do independent consulting and a project here and stuff. I'm not going to go into that. The point is that a big part of my experience there that was very demoralizing was the feeling that, and I was in a really traditionally minded civil and environmental engineering department. So part of it too was particular to my experience in the climate that I was in, right? So your mileage may vary, I'm not downing everything about academia, but I very much felt like we're not preparing students for the present, let alone the future. Because the preparation that we've created was like out of a mindset from decades ago that basically like assumed that by now we'd be living in a George Jetson land. And it hasn't, recalibrated itself to the reality that we're going to live in the coming decades, because that goes against a lot of our cultural mythology and stuff. And I just felt like I couldn't work in that way. Like I felt like everybody thought I was crazy, like I was an alien landed from another planet. They couldn't understand what I was talking about, what I was trying to do. And I just caught friction in every direction for that. So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to have to go do this independently and figure out a different way to do this. But the idea of building local like you said, if we had more farmers, the people would know how to do this, because farmers have to deal with all these different kind of challenges. So we've pushed so many people through the higher education track to specialize in these relatively narrow disciplines. And now what we need are people who can think, but people who have manual and practical skills, that know how to do plumbing or construction or carpentry, or to work with the soil or whatever.
Or to work with plumbers and carpenters to get stuff done. So we don't all have to be able to do everything. No. We have to be able to work together on things.
Right. And so and I see barriers to that. Like a barrier is I don't feel like our educational system is geared to get people into situations where they develop those skills. Like I see our education system as an anachronism and not producing the kinds of people that we need today to do this kind of stuff. Maybe other programs have this and I'm just not aware of it, but my experience was very much not that. The other thing I'm concerned about, this is definitely part of the whole like bullshit of the US culture war, is that there's a major sort of social status divide between people who go through university to get a credential, which is increasingly expensive. And so you have to tell yourself that it's worth it, and it gives you a certain status, even if you've got a master's degree, but you're a barista at Starbucks and you're making 1/6 of what a plumber makes, but you still consider you're better than him. And you would never say like, I need to learn about what that guy does, and I could learn from him and develop some skills, and I can maybe share some of my experience or whatever. Like the social barriers, I feel like are pretty tough. And how do we break that kind of thing down? Because we're balkanized into these kind of cultural subgroups. Do you see that too, or am I just being more? It's just because America's worse at that than other places.
Well, you're talking to somebody who left America in 2000 to try to work on whole systems, energy systems from a holistic point of view, and from that ground level point of view. Because I really didn't think it could be done in America. As a person with a PhD looking for a job, I had to sell my soul to hydrogen or algae biofuel or
It's all a bunch of scams, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Luckily I had seen that and I didn't jump in. I've got friends who were, we were grad students together, and they're still, now what are we, 35 years on, working on the solid oxide fuel cell. That will never be. Like, how depressing is that? But they're on a DOE funded program, and yeah, so for some reason, because maybe I'm a systems thinker, I looked up and just went, I've been working on these really hard problems, which is fun, trying to get new materials and systems work and all that. But even if you got that to work, what would be the point? Is there such a thing as a hydrogen economy? And okay, I'm going to come clean. It wasn't me that figured it out. My son one day asked me, well, is what you're working on, is that going to stop climate change? Oh God, it isn't. Damn it. So it was my little boy worried about his future and climate change that made me actually get that honesty thing in that wasn't there, because I was working on the good stuff. Oy vey. So I went away from the US to have the freedom to work on what I wanted to work on, because New Zealand didn't really have a DOE or a DOD or an SF. So without money, we must think. That is a quote from Ernst Rutherford, the guy who figured out the basic structure of the atom. In New Zealand, without money, we have no money, therefore we must think.
right. Yeah.
Pretty good. So what in the world are we going to do? Well, we've got these institutions, higher institutions, trust in those breaking down, yada, yada. That's why I've developed training for transition engineering. If you're already, like you said, maybe you've trained up, you've learned theory about things, and maybe that isn't engineering, maybe it's social science, maybe it's finance, and you're thinking, yeah, but wait a minute, the world has to change. Well, I'm teaching transition engineering in a transdisciplinary program. I've taught people who do finance. I've taught architects. I've taught school teachers, right? And it's sort of a whole community. If we all have a common language, then we can find a culture, which within whatever culture we're talking about, we can find a culture to do the things we want to do. So if you think about that really primal urge of survival and safety, do you think that whether you're red or you're blue, you are going to disagree about whether little children should be taught not to run out into the street, right? There's basic safety stuff that we probably all agree on. I think.
Yeah.
Do you think it matter if you're red or blue that we should rip airbags out of cars? Would that be a good idea? We really aren't willing to go back on basic survival, I feel. We don't know where we're going forward. We're having terrible arguments about that. But at least when it comes to survival, we're sort of in agreement on things. So it's at that level that I think we can all learn commonalities and start to work together, like I said, on our basic survival, which now we're talking about systems, water, food, energy, housing. These are getting broken as well by the overreach of private extraction of wealth from those systems. Well, we start from where we are and we build back something that works for us, and it's going to be tough because there's, like you say, there's a lot aligned against us. But I think that the transition engineering training that I'm doing, I think you can do it at a master's level, and that'll be sort of maybe in the more corporate world. But I think it's also a ground up sort of thing. I learn how to how to understand the systems you depend on. I think a lot of the angst that we're getting, a lot of the craziness is because people are worried. They're freaking out that the systems they depend on are teetering, that the weather's falling apart, and who's coming to save us? Maybe it'll be Elon. I don't know. Yeah, and now that's falling apart. Oh my gosh. So if we can rebuild things that we can depend on at a very local scale, I think we'll start to get some of that craziness falling away. So I think it's very timely that we figure out what to actually do. So not more things to be worried about, but a thing to actually do today, and not for yourself, but with your neighbors.
Yeah. So a few responses to that. In real life, I'm actually very optimistic about the kind of commonality that you're talking about, where the whole red tribe, blue tribe thing is mainly artificial, and it's mainly imposed in a top-down way because that keeps us fighting, and then we're distracted, and then we can be robbed of whatever. So, I have feet in different worlds. I mean, I've lived and worked abroad, so I've been in different cultures. I grew up in a very working class household in West Virginia, and I have my working class roots are always with me. I live in a very working class town now. I have connections to university. I've been in all these worlds. And if I just lived in one or the other, I would probably be more stressed because the other would seem hostile, But I'm like, I know both these worlds, and I actually know like our commonalities are much greater than it's made to seem, right? All that stuff is amplified because that's how they manipulate us, right? But as soon as you start working together on stuff, that kind of thing really dissolves, and we focus on what we have in common. What I wanted to dig into a little bit more was, what I kind of explained was, I was in the mainstream university system, and I felt like I couldn't work the way I wanted to work, and so I kind of opted out, removed myself into an environment where I think that I can. And you did. I didn't really think about it or put together. You did the same thing. You were like,
I did.
I'm going to have to. In your case, let's go to New Zealand and get into a different context or a different environment. So this is kind of
now in Scotland, because I decided what we've developed by doing that, by having the freedom to ask, how do we, and to work with local communities and the government and corporations, and seeing, wait a minute, we can pull this all back together, actually. Now I've come to Scotland to take a position to build that, to blow it out into the world. I'm hoping to penetrate America at some point, but tomorrow I'm going to Italy to talk to a bunch of people about it there. We have things starting in Germany, in the UK, we're getting a foothold. So yeah, things are still going in New Zealand. And I think there's a role for the professional engineer. Look, if you're not a professional engineer, but you know one, then you should demand that they add to their discipline that transition component. Yeah. That is emerging, and they need to train up, they need to get on board, and they need to look at the systems that they have purview over and look at how to change them. That is just required. So that would make a huge difference in the world if all existing professional engineers took that duty of care, because duty of care is big. It's the one little lever that we have. The big corporations, they must have professional trained engineers. They actually have to, and accountants and managers, and we have professionals, and all those professions adhere to safety discipline. That's why, in general, things are safe, and when they aren't, we sort it out. It's called duty of care. So add to that the duty of care for data security. Oh, we do. Okay. Add to it the duty of care for downshifting our use of fossil fuels, our overuse of materials, our exploitation of people in other countries, and you start to get these big shifts. Now, we also have to rebuild from the ground up. So demand of the professionals, that they get that transition engineering training and start behaving appropriately.
Right. So, okay, this is a good topic to drill into a little bit more. Where you're at in the process in Scotland now, and okay, so I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but it's a little bit like you're you found a way to kind of penetrate the more establishment elements of things.
I think so.
It
Let's
sounds,
just do it.
like where I sort of arrived at in my personal journey was like being demoralized, trying to go up against the system and communicate, even to be able to communicate within the system and make change with the system. I basically gave up. I said, I can't do this. It's not going to work. I'm hitting a dead end. It's not going to work. So
well, you by yourself know. That's why it's so important to have a discipline.
Yeah.
Because you by yourself, good luck to you.
Well, I think so I think a strategy that can work in some contexts, and this probably the reason I think this is probably because I'm a stubborn Appalachian person, and so this is where my mind goes, which is, I want to exercise my freedom to opt out and do something different. So what the approach that I'm currently taking now, and you might have some examples of this or think about how it fits in the overall vision or whatever, is I'm trying to create positive functioning examples of the thing that we're talking about in terms of local economies, in terms of regenerative, agriculture or economic practices that are suited to a particular landscape, ecological context, culture, situation, integrated specifically with the local context, and provides a positive working example that people from a diversity of backgrounds can find a way to plug in and get involved. And so to me, the sort of hippie peacenik in me is like, you're not going to overthrow the system by bashing in the front door, guns blazing and all this. That's their terms. That's how they do it. And we will lose 100% trying to do it.
They'll squash you like a bug.
Yeah. But the way that you can defeat the system is provide an alternative, another option that's attractive enough that people start to say, no thanks to that. This thing over here looks cool. This seems to be. So I'm trying to provide like an inspiring, functioning, and like you're saying, this is not kumbaya stuff. Actually, it's business. I mean, we're trying to run a small farm business with pasture raised meats and stuff. And dude, it is so hard. It is so, I mean, I've been through grad school and PhD and all that kind of stuff. I've done a lot of hard stuff. This is one of the hardest things I've ever done. It is so hard. It is so educational. It draws on so many different resources. And here's a way that somebody, can get an education and experience. And so like, for me, I'm like wanting to put up those alternatives so that people feel like they have a choice. They don't have to like, in the US, you said your friends, they are like, well, I have to work on hydrogen or algae or some environmental gimmick, that your son is going to be like, well, how does that save the climate? And people feel like they don't have a choice. They have to have that career. They have to have that system. They have to have something that tells them who they are personally and professionally and gives them, a level of status and stuff. And so like, and so talk a little bit about, I'm like, I've never been to Scotland, but I'm like, well, they're probably like stubborn rednecks like me. I imagine Scotland's full of those.
Where do you think you came from?
The borderers, the most disagreeable people in the world. That's my people. So, like, what do you think about this sort of interplay between the opting out alternative path versus like interpenetrating the more establishment path? And how do you see those working? And what do you see the advantages and disadvantages?
Right. I think it's an all on board thing that if you're successful and you do lots of work to try and figure out how in the world to take an existing farm that probably has soil degradation history and water problems, and now you got to deal with climate change, and you're trying to sell into a market that's conscripted by the big, big ag and by the supermarket system. And so the market's been really conscripted and turned into something stupid. So it's stacked against you. So if you can figure out how to do it for yourself, then you owe it to the world to create a process-driven approach to how all others can do it. So that's in New Zealand, we had a project where I was aware of a farmer who had taken the industrial agriculture dairy model, which was destroying New Zealand's water and soils and our health, because you get the nitrate pollution of the water, and the sick cows that you're drinking the milk from. And so it's a degradative, extractive, exploitive system, but it's off to the races because, creates wealth, yada, yada. So we knew of a guy who just decided on his own. He was going to take his farm and not use the horrible glyphosate chemicals. He was going to, get to a sustainable, his soil wasn't degrading every year, that it was actually regenerating to a healthy soil and then maintaining. He was going to do that. And man, was that work. It's nearly impossible because you can't make a living because you have to run half the cows. He had to destock. The soil can't take it anymore. The bees can't take it anymore. The plants can't take it anymore, right? But as he was doing it, he found that his animals were healthy and his vet bills dropped off. And he didn't need the inputs because he said he wasn't going to need them, but then he didn't need them. And his plants were healthy. And it looked like he had some healthy pollinators on the place. And then he had organic milk, and that took years, but he now has organic milk. And it turns out that's a different market that is commensurate with the value of the product. And to do that, he actually had to work with his neighbors who were dumping so much glyphosate and so much nitrogen on that it was leaching over into his property. So there's no law against it. So he just had to work with them on understanding what he was doing and just how much overkill they were actually doing. But look, you're clear over there and it's coming clear over here to where I can measure it. And he had to invest in measurement systems. Then, he was getting such a higher value for his milk that it was worth it for a company to come in and build a organic yogurt factory there and use his milk. And so he created a new local market for that product that, now he can get his milk to market because there's now a new economy. And that product is small and kind of boutique, but they find a way to get into the supermarket world and have a little piece of shelf space. And they start, it's more expensive, but man, is it nice. And that's how I came to know him, because that yogurt, even though it's more expensive, if you ever buy it, which I got handed some for doing a talk, they paid me in yogurt. So I'm like, what the hell is this? This isn't the thing. This is something else. And so I start hunting it down. So I got a student who came over from Holland to do his master's in mechanical engineering, and he wanted to do transition engineering. So what we did was we went and visited that guy, studied what he had done, and create a transition map, a transition analysis of that, and understanding the economics in a way that you could actually get an investor to fund your transition, because out of it is going to come a more valuable product.
Yeah.
But you need the roadmap. You need to know what to do, and you need to know how much it's going to cost. And so that he wrote up as basically his thesis was a transition plan. And he took that back to Holland and said, guys, hey, how about this? And it now exists in New Zealand. And I don't know if people are taking it up, because typically of me, I go on to the next project. If there was a discipline of transition engineering, you would know that those things are happening, and there could be a much more widespread market for it. Because people like you would be the people who would, now do this transition engineering for a living at the local level and help those farmers make that change. I reckon that could happen.
That's definitely going to be, that is exactly one of the cruxes of the whole thing. Like, you're telling me a story about this guy that gets a dairy, he's changing it over to be much more.
His passion. He
Yeah,
was triggered to
like,
change because of the disaster of industrial engineering. So he
And
became
it's a ton of work. It's a ton
the
of work,
change.
and it takes time. You can't pop that kind of thing up overnight. So there's a long period where you're just working and working and working, and it costs money, and you're not making anything or not making nearly enough or whatever. So the question is, I mean, I can't go around Appalachia and tell people, hey, I have this great, ecological agriculture business thing. You just have to work at a loss for 10 years, and then it'll turn over. Like, it's not like there has to be a bridge. There has to be a support system for people to do these kind of things. And that's like, I mean, you have to have somebody to bootstrap it, basically, so, and it's probably like a kind of thing where,
Well, let's go to our boiler analogy.
Yeah.
Let's say that somebody was like, damn it, we got to quit blowing up boilers, and I'm going to figure out how to do it, right? Well, if it was ever only just that one guy, it wouldn't have changed the world. It's that it became a discipline of not accepting that suboptimal outcome. We can do better. And so you're an engineer, it turns out, and a farmer. And so think of it as a whole system change, not just yourself, but that it's not acceptable to do the unacceptable. And so there's a method by which to change. And I think when it becomes a discipline, then there will be funding attracted because it's possible to change. It might be that it could be a government grant, it might be industry, it might be community. But if you offer the actual benefit and you can make that case for the benefit, then it is possible to find the funding. So like I said, mechanical engineering was funded by the first ever grant by the US government because we can't keep going like this.
right.
And I think our agriculture is in that state, no matter where you look. We can't keep going like this. Our housing is in that state, no matter where you look. Our transport is in that state. We can't keep driving 2 hours a day. Ugh. Not just because of climate change at all. I mean, we haven't even said the words climate change. Our systems are degradative. And so we fix the degradative and we will find the opportunity to also build the resilience, kick the fossil fuel can down the road. Maybe we just need a little bit of it, but we don't need to be completely dependent on these degradative systems anymore. But you got to think like an engineer here, because it's got to be bigger than one person doing a good thing. You can piggyback off the people who have done that work, but if you're going into that work, like the guy that we worked with in New Zealand, the guy who had, he's going to do it. It's time to converge those people together into discipline. It's not okay to do it the other way. We can now see how to do it the right way. Push that up into legislation, push that up into regulation, push that up into education, push that up into professional practice. It's not okay to do it the wrong way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So tying together the ground level stuff. And if you figured out a way, why shouldn't you, be able to bank that, be able to create a business from that?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the idea with our project. It's not just doing this for ourselves, but to try to show what can be done. And the point is for it to be replicable, and to try to figure out how to reduce the.
Well, think of it as being not just replicable, but the standard.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way.
It's not okay to do it the other way.
The other way.
What you're showing isn't just that it could be different, it's that it must be different. So think about the standards that you would write.
Yeah, I definitely hadn't thought about that. I was more just thinking about, we need to create an example that other people can do and try to figure out how to lower the barriers to entry. It's not going to be like no upfront barriers. That would be impossible. But to get them into it and say, okay, if you have a little bit of resources and you live in Appalachia, here's the kind of things that you can do that will make sense in this context. And you can,
Yeah, but let's talk about shifting from you could do to thou shalt not.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean,
Because that's what I mean by transition engineering. You're engineering the transition of what should not even exist to what's survivable. And that's probably going to look a lot more like lots of small farmers doing things the right way, creates a more co-op version of, but with those barriers, with those regulations in place. And the industrial agriculture that's just basically strip mining,
right.
not okay, and regulated out of existence. But that is what's happened before. So deal with it. The power of a bunch of little ones coming together. Is it possible? I don't know. Let's give it a try.
Right. Well, that's, I mean, that how it plays out, that's definitely I'm interested in. And I feel like,
How stubborn are you? That's what I want to know.
I'm stubborn, but I also, I've had some like really demoralizing experiences, and so part of me is like, I shy away from the moral arguments about how things ought to be or how things ought not to be because, it's right or wrong. Not that I disagree, but I'm just like, really like.
Well, that's only the trigger. That's not the mechanism for change.
Yeah.
That's the trigger for change. So yes, morally, you're correct. Now what?
Yeah. So I guess I kind of like, I always think like, well, failure fixes itself. I can rail against industrial agriculture as being terrible all day. And I'm just a guy, I'm an old weird guy yelling at the cloud, but it's unsustainable. It'll go away of its own accord. I'm just saying we ought to be ready when that happens,
Well, we can't wait for it to destroy everything and therefore go away.
Well, that's why we got to get going now, because it takes time to build the capacity so that we can disentangle our dependence on that unsustainable process and transfer it to dependence on something that's a lot more healthy from an ecological or human standpoint.
Yeah. But that's the monkey trap I was stuck in.
Okay.
Is that, look, if we can engineer the sustainable energy, right? All we need is lower cost solar, lower cost wind, then we can transition to it. And that's what my son caught me out on. That's what he called me out on.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to save the planet, Mom? Mm-mm. You have to actually downshift the bad one.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you need the good one. You need that. But it's a rebalancing. It's about the downshift of the thing we just can't survive. And that takes discipline. And that's why we created the Global Association for Transition Engineering, why I wrote the book, because engineers do have the power to like write standards and say, yeah, no, that's not okay. We can change to this, and we'll help you do that. We will engineer those transitions. They're hard, but we're gonna put our work to that.
Yeah, this has given me some good stuff. I haven't thought this way in a while, or maybe I haven't thought this way before. I've been so focused on all the work that's involved in trying to make something that works, and say, look, I'm going to shut up. As much as I talk on a podcast, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to let a functioning positive example do the talking. The best sermon is a good example, and it'll be so great and so obviously awesome that I won't have to say anything, and people will naturally migrate away from destructive, dysfunctional stuff and to something that naturally attracts people. That's the very hippy dippy way that I think about a lot of this stuff. They're going to be so in love with the positive coolness that I create that they'll forget about all that old bad stuff, And so I think from just personally, I've de-emphasized, in recent years, the sort of trying to combat, but like, I'm glad you're saying this to me, because I'm like, yeah, I mean, I could take a stronger stance on like, these certain things are just unacceptable, and maybe like bring some of the moral force of the argument back in, whereas I kind of shut away from that.
Well, as an environmental engineer, you know what's unacceptable.
I do
know that the over fertilization with nitrogen, chemicals that then eutrophy the water. It's not okay. There should actually be laws against it. Okay, well, if there were laws against it, then they would need to transition to being able to do it right. Okay, but we now know what right is. So engineer those transitions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
going to be hard, but it's possible because you've shown it's possible. So the waiting for the good thing to appear better than the bad thing, that's I think what isn't going to actually fly. It's engineering the transition that is required.
Okay, well, that's really good. I'll definitely give that some more thought because I haven't been thinking about that in a while.
Because how would you do it? Well, I don't know. Figure it out.
I don't know.
And that's where transition engineering, why we start with wicked problems, because that's where you are, is that, yeah, the industrial agriculture version is the one that's winning. You can't change that into what you're doing just because it's better or just because it's right. You have to actually force that change. So engineer it. It is an engineering problem, but not the one you were thinking of.
Right. No, I mean, I'm like day to day, I'm so immersed into like, oh, we had an ice
Just
storm.
trying to get your thing to work. Yeah.
An ice storm made a tree limb fall in the fence. Now a sheep got out. And I got, and so then I'm not about, a regulatory environment that dials down industrial ag. I'm just thinking about my sheep that's running away. Maybe we'll start to wrap soon, but I had a couple more ideas I wanted to bounce around. Okay. So in about 2017 or so, when I was just starting as an assistant professor, the Association of Environmental Engineering and Science, they put out one of these big sort of guidestone documents they called Global Grand Challenges for Environmental Engineering in the 21st Century. Already know everything that's in there and what they say we're supposed to do and stuff like that, right? I'm kind of ambivalent about this stuff. Like my research is in water treatments. It's on decentralized system. It's on absorption processes. It's on mass transfer. It's on chemical contamination. It's like, I have a lane. And part of me likes to stay in my lane and make progress at these actual things in my lane. And when, people come along and tell me that I need to think about saving the world and global problems and all this, I'm like, that sounds a little bit like the kind of grandiosity that got us into this problem in the first place, right? I'm not saving the world. We're not saving the world. That's problematic thinking to me in a various ways. So I try to shy away from it. But at the same time, I'm in a professor job. I'm writing grants, and I have to basically wear this whole thing like a costume and kind of get myself to believe into it so I can write something compelling that the National Science Foundation is maybe likely to fund, right? Put it in their language and in their concepts and start to think, I am going to solve the global grand challenges, right? And I let myself do that, and the conclusion that I came to, part of the conclusion I came to was like, even though I'm in a research job and everything is about, we need more research. I was like, I question how much actually new research we need. To what extent do we already have the tools and knowledge to solve these problems? But we just don't like them, or we discarded them, or we consider they're obsolete, or that's something from the past, or whatever, and I thought, I feel like I could sit down and consider this list of grand challenges, and I could think of ways to address them that are tools and techniques and knowledge that we already have, in many cases have had for centuries, and will work with little need for additional R&D. They cut against our culture and our ideas of progress, but we could actually solve these things. So it would be a heresy to be a researcher and say, actually, we're pretty much good on R&D. We don't need more of that. My department would freak out if I said that. Like, no, you got to get the money. So what I would like to hear about from the transition engineering mindset, when you're saying, okay, we're identifying these things, we're figuring out what our approach is going to be. To what extent is there sort of a reflection on what's worked in the past? Do you go and look through all the things that our culture and society have discarded and say, actually, this was a good solution, we just kind of forgot about it? Like, is there that kind of an element? And to what extent do you think that, in sort of an optimistic vision, this is a bit hippy dippy, but we already have everything we need. We have everything we need. We just have to get our minds right. We have to get our spirits right. And does that ring true at all? Is that a bunch of hippie nonsense, or what do you think about that?
Yes. All right. Couple things in there. Let's see. The grant writing, the powers that be, that sort of thing. I would say we just did that here. We had that same exercise, right? There's grand challenges. There's the sustainability we want, etc. There was a big grant call here where they were looking for that sort of thing. And I put in what we were doing here instead. And what we're doing is we are building a system transition engineering processes program. Systems, so not just the incremental change, transition engineering because it's about change. And the systems transition engineering is definitely convergent. It's about pulling together the things we already know. And it's about the process of doing that. So system transition engineering steps, that's what we're building that program at my university. It's pulling together people from different disciplines to do the actual transitions, to do these hard changes, by pulling together things that we know exist. So no more blue skies. Oh, we could if only we had this new technology or whatever. Yeah, there's going to be new technologies, but because of the mission of change. And we'll figure that out as we go. So I proposed into this grand challenges type fund that we're actually going to build a program to build the capacity to do it. Not the miracle solution, but the capacity to do the actual change. Okay, I know this has got no chance in hell because it's not the thing they're thinking about. It's not even what they're asking for. But this is what we are doing at our university, what we have people across the university agreeing to do. Why? Because I'm a heretic. Because I wrote this book and the president of the university said, hey, hang on. Our university is where the bloody steam engine came from, where the bloody offshore drilling for oil came from. We should be the ones who are where the transition comes from. So he brought me here from Scotland to actually do the thing. And I've been working on doing the thing and pulling together academics and companies and local communities to do the thing. So we wrote up the proposal and we got through. We're one of 5 that are in consideration for the funding. And we get to ask the funder a question. And my question was, why did you pick us? We're clearly not doing, what you asked. And they said, that's why you're here. It's likely that you won't get past the academics, we have to go in front of them and get interviewed. So you probably won't get past that interview board because it's academics looking at things the way they are. But we want you to know that this is what we want. We'll figure out how to get there. You keep going, you build that program, you do it, and we'll support that research. So sure enough, we got to the final 5. We wrote the whole proposal, but we pulled together our group that are going to do this transition engineering program. And we said, this is what we're going to do. And we pulled in a lot of industry that supported us, and we're just continuing on. And yeah, we didn't get that particular fund, but we now know what we're doing.
And it sounds like you have people who get it, or who you have allies in that process up there, even if the academics are not on board. There are other people who are like, we're going to find a way to support what you're doing. It might not be this mechanism, but we're going to find a way. So that's
and so we're carrying on. We're doing our thing. And we're having to take on the big guns. And that includes oil.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
From within our university. And I think that's quite subversive. But that's the sort of thing that transition engineering does. It takes on the incumbents. Not because we want to destroy them, but because we want to transition them. So one of our most interesting things, chapter 8 in my book, is what that looks like when the oil industry transitions and big ag transitions. That's up to you. We could work on that. I don't know exactly what it looks like when big ag transitions, but let's work on that. Big oil, car companies.
At least part of the big ag question is like what you alluded to earlier, which is, I want to say that in the early 90s in the US, the census stopped counting farmers as a category of the population because they had dropped to such a small number overall, like a percent, something like that. And, this anecdote came up recently, and I opened a closet door at our church the other day and saw this, and it reminded me. Did you grow up when you were a kid? Did you play the game of life? Remember that game? Like it's like a board game, and you go around the board and you get a little car and you get a spouse and you put kids in there and all this kind of stuff. Do you remember what happens at that game when you lose? You go to the farm.
Oh,
that's like a meme of our culture right there. Like, oh, you lost the game of life, you ended up back on the farm, which the game was created in the 60s. So that's how they thought, right? We're going to be all modern and all this kind of stuff. So the point that I wanted to make, or at least what does it look like addressing big ag?
that's awful.
We need more people involved in agrarian life systems, right? Like that needs to once again become an attractive idea to people when we've had generations of people being pushed out of that and having that sort of labeled as backwards and stupid and all this kind of stuff. So there's a kind of a marketing challenge of showing. So that's part of my motivation in trying to create this little project that's attractive and positive, and everything, is that people will go, actually making a life that way, I actually want to do that. Like there's a lot of reasons to want to do that. And the big thing is like, so Nate Hagens, points out that if you take the amount of energy that's in one barrel of oil, that costs whatever now, about $70 a barrel or whatever it's at right now, the amount of energy in one barrel of oil is equal to a human being working for 4.5 years, right? So that's why we've substituted machinery and chemicals and fossil fuels for everything, because people are always the most expensive element when you conceive of it that way. So that's why we get all the people out of agriculture and have it all machines and chemicals and fuel, right? So the antidote to that is we have to become reinterested in agrarian lifestyles as a mode of life. And as people want to do
lifestyles.
Systems
lifestyles. It's I don't think that go back to it. I think solutionism isn't right, as you said. And I don't think go back to ism is right either. I think we have broken down stuff and we got to rebuild it. But I think we got to rebuild it in a way that actually works, given what we know. So transition engineering, funny thing, we start with wicked problems. And then the first step is to really understand what's wrong, what it is that's wrong. What are we doing wrong? Now that is what we take back to 1911. So step one is to go to 1911. Take a time travel. Go to 1911, but take that question about what's gone wrong back to 1911. When we did it for agriculture, what went wrong was what's gone wrong with agriculture? What's the wicked problem? What's gone wrong?
I mean, I would call it everything stemming from fossil fuel dependence and over reliance on harsh chemicals. And
but why? Why is that what you're doing?
Because like what we did was, you said it'd be more efficient if we put all the animals over here and their waste becomes a problem, and we put all the crops over here and then they lack nutrients. So we took a solution of having an integrated agriculture and we divided it into multiple problems, that rely on tons of energy to make up for the deficiencies of those approaches. So to me, like what went wrong was moving away from a more diverse integrated approach to agriculture, where there are animal systems and plant systems and the waste from one system fed into another system, but that takes more human attention, more input, like it takes actual labor and participation. And the economic incentives with fossil fuels were like, get humans out of the equation and make it more productive per hectare or per whatever, rather than
I think you found it there.
Yeah.
What went wrong is more productive.
Well, but
that
that's,
we always have to be more productive, that next year the cow has to have 5 teats instead of 4. The tree has to produce more apples than this year. It's the more productive, less people, less expense, more production. So it's capitalism that's gone wrong.
well, yeah. I mean, sure, but like, China was communist under Mao, and they did equally, or if not worse, things in their agriculture. It's not really capitalism, communism thing. It's more of a growthism,
Yeah.
accumulation, of material wealth. The need for, I mean, that's, to me, that's my sort of like, not facetious, but not actually facetious comment about we should stop talking about climate change, because we don't address that until we address the fact that we're dependent on consuming large and ever increasing quantities of fossil fuels for everything that we depend on. And all of that drives GDP growth. And we're in a mindset that thinks that the prime directive is to maximize GDP growth, which is stupid for a bunch of reasons, right? But like they're
and in the agricultural context, it means producing more off the same amount of land every year. That's why you've overstocked. That's why you're dumping the nutrients on, because you've taken out a mortgage to produce more every year. So you've bought the bigger tractor, you've bought the rotating cow shed, you've overextended. In my book, I use to show what's wrong with this economics that we're bowing down to. I use an agricultural model. I use the apple guy. So it's a story about a guy who has an apple tree. He has an apple orchard, and he's doing okay. Thanks very much. He's not really participating in the economy. And then his friend comes by and says, if you picked apples and put them in a basket and took them to the market, you could sell them and make more money and maybe buy some cheese. The apple guy goes, but I got to buy a basket so I can take in a cart to take the apples to market. Yeah, I guess you do. But I could make money. Yeah. Okay. That's worth it to buy to buy a basket and a cart. Sure enough, he has to get up out of his chair. He has to pick apples. He has to push them to the market. He has to sell them. So he has to invest. But he does make money back, and he can buy some cheese. That's nice. And then the market where he took the apples, now people are buying the apples, and maybe they're making pies, and maybe they're making cider. And so there's more economy. So the economy's growing. And he's bringing the apples. It's all good until he can't reach the apples anymore. Now he has to decide, is it worth it to get a ladder to get more apples? Well, not more apples, actually less, because I got to climb up and get them. But I still got to get them to the market. And now he's getting pressure. We need more apples in the market. Okay, so he buys a ladder, takes more risk, climbs up the ladder, fills his basket with apples. Now he has to get down the ladder with the apples. But he's got them. He gets them to market, but not as many. So now they're starting to get more expensive. People are starting to panic, but we need the apples. We got to have the apples. Because we've invested in the cider press, and because we've invested in the pie oven. We got to have more apples. Mayor, we need more apples. Okay. There isn't any more apples. Well, there's more up there at the top, but I can't reach them with my ladder. Okay, what are we going to do? Going to invest in a cherry picker? Kind of like hydrogen, right?
Yeah.
We want more apples, but we can't really get them. So what are we going to do? We're going to invest in some fantasy technology no, that doesn't make sense. We can invest in a chainsaw. Right? We've overshot.
Right. So this actually brings up a question that I meant to ask you about. So yeah, transition engineering is about the process and how you actually force this kind of change to happen. Okay.
Well, transition engineering would be about well, what are we actually going to do? Well, you're going to have to deal with no more apples till next year.
Right, right. Well,
The
like what you were describing,
market is going to have to deal with not having more production growth all the time.
right? Like what your story was illustrating for me was this sense of being on a treadmill, of always having to, like, the way that we currently deal with scale is we say yes more, just scale more, just scale more, just scale more, just scale more. That's that, and we're on this treadmill constantly trying to increase scale. So there's a concept, I think, from ecology, Howard Odum or something, about the maximum power principle, about how ecological systems, don't tend to like transition from one energy form to another, but just add more onto the system. Like your story was reminded me of how, it's like Art Berman, if you know his work, he argues that there really is no energy transition. We just keep piling more on. Like solar and wind are just more ways to use energy. They're not actually displacing fossil energy, because our philosophy is we are to keep trying to scale up more and more and more. But what we actually have to do is, is actually cut energy and resource throughput, right? And I think that some of the arguments are that, like, yeah, and like in the history of evolution, no one's ever done that. Like, that's not a.
I know. That's why you need the transition engineering. Why it takes so much innovate. It's not even innovation, because innovation is adding more features to the thing you've got. It takes invention. It takes ingenuity, and that's why I do think that farmers have to deal with that all the time. They have to deal with problems, predicaments that they haven't seen before. That's where we're at.
Yeah. I mean,
how are you going to deal with constraint? Take some inventiveness. So yeah, we take that issue is that you think you need more. Back to 1911. Okay, well, what were you doing in 1911? Well, usually on the farm, you weren't expecting you were always going to have more in 1911.
mm-hmm.
You had much more of a steady state. So what was the farm system like in 1911? It would be very good to know. Not because we particularly can recreate it, because usually we can't, but we're going to learn about that system in 1911. What was it like? What was the market like that it was feeding? What was the society like that it was supplying? And we're looking for key things about what it's like to not have the growth element in it. There was a lot of industrial growth taking off at that time, but it was more in the steam area than in the farm area. And so, yeah, we study 1911. We look at how things have changed till now, because we really have to understand, how did we get to where we assume that this was the way to do it? Where did that come from? And then we look at, what do we think our solutions are right now? What do we think they are? Let's test them. Let's crash test them. Let's crash test. Do we really think, with numbers, like engineers, is that going to get us to the solution? And that's where, maybe it's bad news that you doing a good thing and trying to show other people might be part of the solution, but probably not the solution. And then the fun part is we take a leap forward to 2125, 100 years from now. The fossil fuel's gone. It's not in the system anymore, one way or the other. The 2125 that we go to is the one where whatever it was that we needed to do, we did. So we haven't cooked the planet. We haven't overused fossil fuels. We've actually downshifted them so that there is a bit of fossil fuel for what we really need it for in 2125. What would that be? I don't know. Take some work to think about it. Search around. It might be a little bit for agriculture. That tractor is actually a very useful thing. Maybe society thinks that's where a little bit of fossil fuel should go, but probably not for global movement of bottled water or global movement of things that don't really need to be moved. Definitely not for personal transport. that is a matter of reorganization. So that's what we see in 21-25 is that there is a an organization and a movement of goods that need to be moved, but probably on electric trains, not trucks. And the personal transport moving around by car, that's just not really a lot of sensible there, that amount of energy use and material use. So this time travel to a time where people just haven't lost their minds the way we're worried that we're going to now.
I guess I would say this is where I'm pessimistic on it. Like I certainly,
Well, you have to imagine it.
I agree with the idea, but I feel like you know, the things are probably going to unfold in a more chaotic and less planned way, and it's going to be responding to, you know, the circumstances. You know, I'm certainly in favor of planning out a smart trajectory that reduces damage to the biosphere and reduces human suffering and all that. I'm totally in favor of that. But I guess if I'm like trying to make a guess of how realistic I think that is versus I think there's going to be more of a fragmentation and people saying we're going to have to, you know, we're hobbits in the Shire. We're just going to have to worry about the Shire, you know, because like all that stuff in Mordor, we can't do anything about that, you know.
Well, that's a projection, and the 21-25 process that we use in transition engineering, it does take a bit to work through what you're talking about, but it's just whether it just requires that you're willing to open a third door. So it's not a projection of what we already know or what we hope. It's an opening of a third door that could exist. There could be a future where whatever it was needed to be done got done. So the main thing that needs to be done is the downshift of fossil fuel and the downshift of unsustainable economic activities. Yeah. Now, how that actually happened, don't know. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
But there is still possibly a future, a third door, a possibility that the downshift of the unsustainable things occurred. What does that look like? Where does that take us? Because we want to understand that future so that we can understand the value of doing it. We can bring that back to today and say, okay, I get that those downshifts don't look likely right now, but I've seen the value in doing it, and I'm going to tap that now. I'm going to invent that.
I got you.
We don't know what it is a lot of times until we go exploring. We go exploring with the systems knowledge that we built by looking at the system 100 years ago. You know, not a one-for-one translation, but a systems knowledge that we can only get by looking at history. It's just an education. It's how systems work. And with that knowledge, and with the knowledge that the future that we're following now just isn't a future. It's some kind of bad thing. We're not going to go there. The solutions, the miracle solutions that we might have been hoping for, they don't get us to a future that's survivable either. So we put those away and open the third door. That third door, like I said, something happens, don't know what yet, it's okay, but you know, that downshift of what's unsustainable, where does that get us?
Right.
I mean, every time so far, the value of doing it is so enormous.
Well, yeah, I definitely get that.
So you're a little farther down that road in agriculture.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say where I am. The anecdote that I'm thinking about is, so when I had dropped out of grad school back in the day, and then I worked in Asia, started working on water systems on the Thai-Burma border, working with refugees and stuff, and then decided to go back to grad school to focus on the absorption stuff that I was working on. That was part of that work. So I had this wild transition in my life that was where I had been working with hill tribe people on the border of Burma, you know, in a semi-hot conflict situation where the Burmese military is, you know, trying to genocide them, basically take their land, take them into forced labor. And it's a really unstable situation. And I'm working with all these hill tribe people, and like, as an American, like, we're setting up water systems and water filters and stuff. And I want to go through and I want to glue all the PVC together, right? So there's a leak. And they're like, no, don't glue it. Don't do glue it. They're like, we're probably gonna have to take it apart later anyway. And you see their houses, the way they build their houses, they don't cut the boards off to fit a nice neat corner. They just put it up. And they're like, we're probably gonna have to leave it, or we're gonna have to take boards off of our house and sell them for money or something. So they were like living in a mode of like this pretty unstable situation that they have, and they have to respond to whatever's going on, doing what makes sense at the time, and solving the problems as they come up. But they're just accustomed, because this has been a conflict for 60 or 70 years, and they're just accustomed to being under these circumstances, right? So that's kind of the environment that I'm trying to figure out how to solve problems in a way and like resist my thing of like making something permanent or caring about sustainability, and more like, how do we solve it in a way that really actually makes sense for what your reality? And then I go to Boulder, and I'm in a class, an academic grad class on sustainable community development, where you get all the jargon, the buzzwords, and theories, and all this kind of stuff. And I would realize, I'm like, when I'm working in the field, we never talk about sustainability. We're like, does this work or not?
Survivability, isn't it?
Yeah. Is it gonna solve the problem or not? It's more like when you get together with a bunch of affluent upper middle class people who, this is my theory on why we talk about sustainability so much. Because when, upper class, whatever, Western liberals talk about sustainability, we're saying a prayer to God. Dear God, please let me keep my unsustainability. I really like it. It's really nice. I want to feel okay about it. I'll buy a Prius. I promise.
Yep.
It's like this kind of a nursery rhyme to make us tamp down the feelings of dread over the deeper realization that we can't really hang on to what we have. So that's my kind of view of that sort of thing. But it's shaped my thinking that, if you do your like time travel to the future, envision how we dial down
a particular future. It's the constrained future, the one that we are really afraid exists.
And you could show
We're going to go there anyway.
The value is so much greater if we take ourselves on that path. But I feel like what we actually do as humans is okay.
Well, it's a different kind of value, though. That's the thing. It's a different kind of value.
What's that?
That future with the constrained consumption.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of value. It's not the one we're used to thinking of. So
right, no, certainly.
that exploration of that is very often challenging. I find that for the students, it's not the way we think about it.
So it's a double challenge, right?
Because how the heck do you quantify the value of actual clean water?
Yeah.
Cows that aren't just being treated like milk factories.
Yeah. I totally agree.
Animals.
What I'm concerned about is that, when we have resource depletion, and the economies of nations are dependent on inputs of resources, and, I feel like that we're a lot more actually governed we did what made sense at the time, or like, well, we've got to fight these guys over the last bits of that resource. And I don't like that. I'm not for that, but I'm also kind of like, I think that's probably what we're going to do, even though I would say, let's do something different than that. I don't think that my preferred vision is going to be the vision that we actually interact with. So I'm kind of like, okay, so if my preferred way of doing things doesn't pan out, and instead I'm responding to, a much more undesirable thing, does that change my game plan? You see, there's kind of, it's like an envisioning and then a re-envisioning, saying like, that's what I prefer, but the likelihood is low. So instead, this seems to be, if I go to the hill tribe people, lecture them.
And there's a difference between being where you are and thinking, what are the probabilities or the likelihoods of what could happen? And I agree with you, it's not great.
Yeah. But
that is a likelihood of what is going to happen without any intervention, without the invention part. The way to get the invention is to go to the place where that invention happened. So it's an inventor's trick to be able to separate yourself from the probability of what's going to happen without the intervention, which is where we live. That's our lived experience. And now create a lived experience from a different plane, from a different universe, because that's what you're actually looking for, is what do they have in the future that we don't have? What is it that allows them to live that way and be okay? And it's survivable, and it has these other values that we've even forgotten. Yeah. But they have them, and it's good. I mean, it's great that they don't have to worry about the shit we have to worry about. So what is it that they've got that we don't have that lets them do that? Because that's what I want to invent.
So the idea is you go there to the future and you see that you do that mental scenario, and
Yes.
then say, okay, now we go
Trick the brain into working on a thing that's really hard to see from right here. Because our brains just have so much capability for that ingenuity generation. We really do. But we aren't giving ourselves that to work on because we're just caught up where we are. So yeah, the transition engineering processes, it's a way to bring the mental powers into the space we need. And I know not everybody can probably do it, but if we've got a few people who can, that new narrative is so powerful that it opens up a future that doesn't exist without that work.
I think, okay, so what, if I'm understanding you right, what I'm envisioning is, okay, go to 2025 or whatever, envision this, like these key transition steps occurring to get to that higher value future, and then come back to 2025, 2030 and say, what is it we need to be doing right now that actually is laying the flagstones of that path, which includes, like, okay, political power is going to be
in the current real world.
You can't just solve stuff and do stuff because the powers that be are going to fight you and try to defeat you. So you're going to have to include in your plan some way of neutralizing the threats, essentially, that come from the status quo. That have to.
Well, it is a interesting problem, that's for sure. I mean, it's the reality of the real world, which is why you need the experts in the real world, the experts of this real world. Why it can't be solved by the people outside of it. You have to. It's almost like we need viruses from the inside, because we need to change that real world. But with this new, invention that actually does that change. So yeah,
this is great. This is probably a good place to wrap. It's been on a long time. You've been super, super generous. But this actually, I think, ties into other conversations that have happened on this podcast that I haven't been a part of. But there are some people that are explicitly looking at the sort of somewhat volatile influx political environment that we're in the West, but especially in the States, and thinking about leverage points and thinking about, I'm the hippie that moved out to the country and said, to hell with that, I'm gonna go do my own thing, and I kind of put all that aside. There's other people that are thinking like, no, I think we can make inroads and we can get in and we can get some of these ideas in there. But I had just given up on that stuff, and I'm not saying I'm right to have given up. I'm just saying that's kind of where I got to.
No, I get it.
But the thing is like what you're talking about. I think like the idea that you gotta go to the future and then plan backwards, and you also have to include a sort of like an antibody immunological defense program for your transition program, because you are going to be hitting friction, you're going to be hitting conflict, you're going to be hitting opposition.
It's not easy. This really takes work.
Yeah,
it's so complex, and it's maybe more like trying to win a war or something, in that you got to be considering a whole bunch of things and actors and motives and that. But if you can find that key, and a key that is in the whole system, that whole, the reason we go to 1911 is for the whole system learning, not for a particular thing, but to be able to think in whole systems. which isn't our forte at the moment.
Mhm.
We're very reductionist, as you said.
Right. Right. Well, well, I don't know if you have any final thoughts or anything you want to add, but I super appreciate your work. I always have, and the time that you've given and stuff. And this is definitely, I was like really trying to hit you some like nasty curveballs and stuff, but like now I'm like, oh crap, now I got a lot of stuff that I got to rethink. But that's good. That's good.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch because the stuff you're thinking about, we are working on that, and we're definitely working on agriculture because that's a key one. If we don't get that resurrected, we're in big trouble. And so again, think about that convergent effort of all the people who have figured, who have stuff that we do need to know. How do we get that together and method? Make it more of the standard or the method. Then you can actually push back on the things that shouldn't be the way they are. Standards are really, they historically have so much power. I mean, we think of them as, oh, they're just minimums. Yeah, but look at what they've actually done in history, and it's massive. So, yeah, what is the standard for?
That's good. That's good. I haven't thought about that stuff in a long time, and now I'm going to. Well, anyway, we should wrap. Thank you so much for taking.
Yeah.
And I'll definitely keep in touch, and maybe there'll be some opportunity.
Well, go get that book of mine because
I have it.
last
I have it somewhere. I don't know where it is. It's in here somewhere. I have it.
Oh yeah. All right, good.
Yeah.
Well, look back at the last chapter. That was my that's the red pill one. I think it's called red pill. Is it where the little virus that can infect the status quo? Kind of tucked it in there at the end.
Okay, I have to go back and remind myself. I think I bought it it came out like 10 years ago, right? 5 years ago. Okay.
Yeah, it needs a reboot because we've got more tricks of the trade now, that's for sure. More of those processes of actually how to do these things. That looks like the seminal idea, but the how to is now getting way better.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. And
all right,
try to catch up with you again sometime.
You bet. Good to talk to you.